They called her Terrible, and from the moment the first surveyor's rope snapped against the wet, black basalt clawing its way out of the North Pacific, the name was not hyperbole but a prophecy, a bone-deep acknowledgement that Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was less a sentinel of mercy and more a stark, granite monument to nature's utter contempt for human ambition, a place where the very elements conspired in a ceaseless, roaring campaign to drive men mad, break stone, and extinguish light, earning its fierce reputation not through a single cataclysm but through a daily, grinding horror that began with a tempestuous birth in 1879 when engineer John Trewavas, a seasoned veteran of English reefs, was swept from the slime-slick rock and swallowed whole by the sea, a sacrificial offering that set the tone for all that would follow, a harbinger of the relentless siege that would define the rock's existence, where construction itself became a 4-year war of attrition fought by a rotating army of convicts and desperate laborers who dynamited the summit into a flat table only to have their tools and tents torn away in the night, their supply ships often unable to land for weeks, leaving them clinging to a barren, guano-stained islet with only the cries of the 10,000 seabirds, the murres and gulls whose domain they had invaded, and the apocalyptic percussion of waves against the stone for company. A sound described not as a crash but as a deep, internal shudder that vibrated through boot soles and teeth, a constant reminder that their footing was precarious and the ocean's patience infinite, and when the lighthouse finally cast its first beam on January 21, 1881, it was a victory so hard won it felt less like a triumph and more like a temporary flag planted in hostile territory. The 62-foot tower and attached keeper's quarters not a sanctuary but a magnificent prison designed by Albert Johnson to withstand blows that would flatten a fortress, with walls up to 4 feet thick, iron shutter doors, and a lantern room of the stoutest cast iron and bullseye prism glass, yet from the very first keeping, the men of the lighthouse service learned that Terrible Tilly was an entity with a personality, a capricious, violent genius for devising new torments, for the isolation was not mere distance but a profound psychological stripping, where keepers assigned to the rock entered a realm of sublime and terrifying grandeur where gale-force winds were not an event but the default weather, where winter storms routinely hurled spray and stone over the 133-foot summit to smash against the lantern itself, obscuring the light with a salt slime that required constant, perilous cleaning, and where the ordinary sounds were a deafening orchestra of shrieking wind, booming water, and the grinding groan of the rock itself, punctuated by the sudden, heart-stopping impacts of sneaker waves, colossal, silent walls of water that would rise without warning from a deceptively calm sea to explode against the tower with the force of dynamite, shaking the very foundation, blowing out the iron storm panes as if they were paper, and flooding the living quarters with icy, brine-choked water that ruined provisions, shorted the telegraph, and left the men shivering in darkness, their world reduced to the swaying circle of a kerosene lamp and the unbearable tension of waiting for the next blow, a tension that frayed nerves and twisted camaraderie into petty animosity, for the quarters, though engineered for survival, were claustrophobic and damp, perpetually smelling of mold, bird guano, fuel oil and the faint, metallic scent of fear, where the 4 men, typically a head keeper and 3 assistants, were trapped together for months on end with only a weekly tendering of supplies and news that was often cancelled for weeks at a time during the brutal winter months, making them true prisoners of the rock, their only connection to a receding world a telegraph wire that frequently failed, their loneliness amplified by the haunting sight of the mainland's distant, silent lights, a cruel taunt of a normality forever out of reach, and it was this combination of physical extremity and psychological erosion that cultivated the lighthouse's terrifying lore, documented in keeper logs that read like dispatches from a battlefield, entries detailing how storms hurled 135-pound boulders through the roof of the oilhouse, how keepers found 300-pound rocks deposited in the courtyard as if by a giant's hand, how the constant, jarring vibration shattered crockery and rattled fillings loose from teeth, and most famously, the great storm of October 1934, a legendary blow that broke a window in the lantern room over 130 feet above sea level and hurled a stone through the delicate Fresnel lens, shattering prism glass across the floor and leaving the light dark until a heroic and nearly impossible repair effort could be mounted, an event that cemented Tilly's reputation as an unconquerable foe, for if the very summit of man's engineering atop this terrible rock could be so violated, what hope had the spirit? The keepers themselves, those anonymous and stalwart men, became folk heroes and cautionary tales, their endurance measured in the tremors of their hands and the distant look in their eyes upon rotation back to the world, with stories circulating of men who refused to return, who chose lesser posts or quit the service entirely rather than face another tour on the rock. And of those who did return, many spoke little of it, the experience being incommunicable to those who had not felt the rock shudder beneath them, a fraternity of trauma bound by the shared knowledge that their workplace was also a potential tomb, a fact grimly underscored in 1960 when a rogue wave during a resupply operation tore a carpenter named Obie Old Bones Miller from the derrick cable and swept him to his death, adding another name to Tilly's ledger, a ledger that began with chihuahuas and would never truly close. This reputation for being terrible was thus a holistic verdict. It was terrible to build, terrible to supply, terrible to inhabit, and terrible to maintain, an economic black hole for the Lighthouse service that demanded exorbitant costs in materials, manpower, and sheer human will, and when automation finally came in 1957, it was less a retirement and more a surrender, a concession that no human spirit should be asked to endure such a posting any longer, the machinery taking over the watch as the last keepers gladly abandoned the stone giant to the elements, but even in abandonment, Tilly's ferocity persisted, as subsequent owners found her an impossible charge, her structure crumbling under the very assaults she was built to defy, her roof caving in, her iron rusting, until she was ultimately sold and consecrated as a columbarium, a final, fitting evolution into a literal tomb, a resting place for ashes where the spirits of the dead could mingle with the ghosts of the keepers and the eternal, booming lament of the rock itself, a place that today stands as a ruin, a stark, beautiful, and terrifying silhouette against the horizon, still defiant, still unyielding, still whispering through the salt-tinged wind the reasons why. For over a century, every mariner, every keeper, every engineer, and every soul who knew her story uttered the name with a mix of